respect to that context, it will not also count as a midget with respect to that same context. So when calibrated against a common context, those two sets tend to be disjoint and nothing can be in both. Now, a principle that affects the other two cases is what we've called here the head primacy principle. In a structure that has a head and a restrictive modifier, as most of these adjective noun constructions are, it seems that we first interpret the head in the larger context, and then we interpret the adjective or the modifier relative to the head, that is, relative to the context augmented by already having interpreted the head in it. So the modifier is interpreted relative to the local context created by interpreting the head in the first context. So the midget giant case, there are various different contexts in which you might have interpreted giant. We might be talking about fairy tale context, or we might just be talking about basketball players or something. And we have some context in which we've decided what's going to count as giants. We get that set up first. Then within that context, we figure out what we're going to count as midgets. So that midget giant versus giant midget has to do with which noun was the head noun. That's the one that dominates, and the other one will be reinterpreted in that context. Now, what drives the reinterpretation? Well, in part, we think it's a very general non-vacuity principle. That is, in any given context, try to interpret any predicate so that both its positive and its negative extension are non-empty. As in a given context, if you're trying to interpret, say, sharp, relative to a given context, you should interpret sharp in such a way that some things will count as sharp and some things will not. If everything counts as sharp, it's not going to be useful, a useful use of the term. If nothing counts as sharp, it's not going to be useful. So this non-vacuity principle says when you're calibrating a vague term in a given context, try to do it so that there will be some things that are and some things that are not. So that also affects this midget giant case. Once you've decided what giants are, you might just say, well, then in that context, nothing is a midget. But the non-vacuity principle says recalibrate midget so that some of the giants will count as midgets and some won't. So that then you will let it apply to whatever are the very smallest giants in that context. And that, in the midget giant and giant midget cases, we had to stretch the positive extension of the modifier to satisfy the non-vacuity principle. That is, we had to stretch the notion of midget to get there to be some midget giants. But there are other cases, such as in 36, where the same principle, the same non-vacuity principle, leads us to shrink the positive extension so as to have some negative cases as well as some positive ones. In this case, it leads us to shrink the positive extension of the modifier sharp, since otherwise the truth of 37, knives are sharp, would make the modifier in 36, this is a sharp knife, completely redundant. So once you've decided knives are sharp, then why would you ever say sharp knife? They all are. But you see, when we do say sharp knife, we mean sharp among knives. So we make a much more stringent qualification of what's going to count as a positive instance of sharp in that context. Okay, so putting some of these things together, let's just look a little bit at some of the varieties of concepts and conceptual combination that we. Oh wait, let me back up the end of that previous section. These principles that I've just talked about put together, they can explain the striped apple case. That was the puzzle I started that section with. The striped apple is plain conjunction. It is just the conjunction of the two concepts and can be done by the principles of supervaluation theory that I had mentioned before. But first you recalibrate striped in the context of apple. And that's how it can then come about that some objects will judge to be better instances of striped apple than they were of striped, where that was all alone in the context, and apple when that was all alone in the context. Okay, varieties of concepts and conceptual combination. Well, there's, first of all, well, this isn't just summary because some of these things I haven't said explicitly. There are cases where, when we look at what the best we can do with these kinds of principles, we have to conclude that in some cases, meaning is not to be regarded as closeness to prototype, even if the concept does have a clear prototype. And such cases include male nurse, pet fish, and Texan grandmother. And consider your prototype for grandmother. I mean, we're all raised with a certain prototype for the notion of grandmother. Consider your prototype for the notion of a Texan. I don't know what it's like in Iowa, but I know what it's like in Massachusetts. And those prototypes just don't go together. And a prototypical Texan is tall, male, and is wearing cowboy boots. And the prototypical grandmother has white hair and is sitting in a rocking chair and knitting something. I mean, we know this has little to do with the truth, but we're talking about prototypes here. Now, does that mean there shouldn't really be any Texan grandmothers? No. It means in those cases, the prototype for grandmother really has nothing to do with whether someone is a grandmother or not. She can still be running on the Olympic running squad and be a grandmother. You know, the fact that she doesn't fit the prototype has nothing to do with what is or is not a grandmother. And similarly, whether somebody does or doesn't wear cowboy boots has nothing to do with whether he really is or is not a Texan. So the meaning combination of Texan grandmother is not to be derived from the prototypes, because for those concepts, prototypes are not determining extension. And similarly for pet fish, whether something is or is not a pet is not a matter of its resemblance to the prototypical pet. And I think similarly for most natural kind words like bird and fish, despite the fact that Rosh and others have gotten all the prototypicality judgments to come out clearly for saying that a robin is a prototypical bird and a penguin is very nearly not a bird. That may be fine for judgments of prototypicality, but it doesn't really seem to be determinative of the semantics of a concept like bird. So in those cases, meaning can be determined compositionally using standard techniques, but the prototype of a compound concept is not any systematic function of the prototypes of the individual concepts. This is not an argument against prototype theory per se, but indicates some of the limits of its application to the analysis of compound concepts. But unlike Osherson and Smith, we still believe there are cases where meaning really is a matter of closeness to prototype. So for instance, with color terms like red, that seems a very good analysis of notion of red, that whether something is or is not red is very much a matter of how close it is to the clear cases of red. Red is a vague term, and it's vague. Its application falls off as you get farther and farther in any direction from clear cases of red. And chair probably is a good example of a term where prototype is determinative of extension. Whether something does or doesn't count as a chair, there aren't many criteria other than how much it resembles a typical chair. In these cases, meaning can be determined compositionally using the kinds of techniques sketched above. Appeal to prototype isn't directly part of the mechanism, but the same mechanisms can be adapted to calculate what should be a prototypical case of the compound concept. And those cases tend to be relatively well behaved. A prototypical red chair should be a kind of prototypical looking chair that is a clear case of red. Now in some of these we may have some of the recalibration of concepts sketched above, but it still seems to work. So the chart at the bottom of page 7 sketches some of the varieties of concepts and shows that we have examples in 5 of the 6 different categories represented here, where on the vertical dimension, the ones in the top half of the chart are those that are vague, ones in the bottom half of the chart we submit as candidates of concepts that are not vague. The ones in the leftmost column are ones that do not have a prototype, and that includes both some vague concepts and some non-vague ones. Vague concepts like tall and wide and heavy, they're vague words all right, but prototype theory doesn't seem to be the right way to analyze their vagueness, because it isn't like there's a certain height which counts as prototypical degree of tallness, and whatever way you deviate from that makes you a less good case of tallness, the taller the better, so to speak. And there isn't any central notion of tallness the way there's a central notion of red, and similarly for heavy and wide. And another example in that category is not red. Now, red is a vague term. Not red is also a vague term. Red is a vague term that we can argue does have a prototype. But what would the prototype of not red be? Because there you can deviate from red in several different directions, and there isn't any one kind of color that you could take as the prototypical not red. So the logic of prototype theory gets complicated by the fact that a concept may have a prototype, but its negation will often not have a prototype, for instance. And among, non-vague terms that don't have a prototype, you sort of expect that, but inanimate, odd set of numbers, or not a bird, for instance. Now, among the ones that do have prototypes, the two rightmost columns, we've subdivided them further into the ones that are marked minus PE. Those are the ones where we believe the concept does have a prototype, but the prototype is not what's determining the extension. So it's not the thing you want to underlie the semantics of the expression, and you don't expect the prototype to play a role in the semantics of compound concepts involving that expression. Whereas the ones on the right are the ones where we believe, examples of ones where we believe the prototype does play a central role in determining the extension, and those are the ones where combining the concepts will often result in the existence of a prototype for the compound concept as well. So ones where prototype does not determine extension, even though they're vague, are ones like adolescent, also the ones I mentioned above, like pet, fish, Texan, grandmother, things like tall tree. Ones where the prototype does determine the extension, among vague ones, are red, chair, maybe things like bully and shy, for instance. And among the non-vague ones, some of them have a prototype, but in all the ones where it's a non-vague term, like, for instance, grandmother, they will all be cases where if it does have a prototype, the prototype will not be what's determining the extension. There aren't any in the category of non-vague terms that have a prototype that's determining its extension. So where the prototype does determine the extension, that's all a matter of resolution of vagueness. So conclusions I've spelled out on page 8. We believe that there are cases where resemblance to a prototype does play a central role in determining the extension of terms, and where the phenomena of vagueness are therefore inextricably linked up with the logic of concepts and conceptual combination. In these cases, there must be a way to specify compositional principles for interpreting conceptual combinations, or the basic principle of compositionality is threatened, and the predictability of speaker-hearers' interpretations of novel combinations becomes a mystery. And we've argued that there are a number of factors that must be taken into account in trying to articulate a compositional theory adequate to the challenge presented by vague concepts. One of the important factors we identified was context dependence. Wherever there's vagueness, we may expect to find context dependence, since the context is what helps us resolve or narrow down the vagueness in most cases. And the effects of context, both linguistic and non-linguistic context, are clearly quite diverse. It's often very hard to draw lines between linguistic, conceptual, and real-world knowledge, and vagueness clearly adds to the difficulty of discriminating between attributes intrinsic to a given concept and those that may be accidentally and yet very frequently associated with it. Our positive suggestions in response to the problems we've pointed out are largely samples of kinds of methods that we believe might be fruitfully exploited in constructing a comprehensive compositional theory of conceptual combination. Our aim has been primarily to identify the kinds of issues that need to be resolved, to show that several factors interact at once, and to try to make plausible that one can discern robust compositional principles of combination underneath the tangle of idiosyncratic and variable detail. To the skeptic, it might seem that compositionality has very little force if the basic principles are complicated and almost obscured by such a variety of contextual factors, lexical differences, etc. But it must be reiterated that compositionality in some form appears to be a crucial part of any account of semantic competence. And it's also possible to look at the demand for compositionality together with other quite general principles like those suggested in section 5.3, the parallel structure effect, the head primacy principle, the non-vacuity principle, as central driving principles which induce much of the recalibration and reinterpretation that we seem to find. There I end. Thank you. That's an issue we have struggled with from time to time. We're not always clear that we can be sure of a difference between stereotype and prototype. Maybe it would be better. The Texan grandmother example is a fun one. Maybe it would be better to use the pet fish example, because in the case of pet fish, I think people have been more inclined to invoke prototype theory there. But there, I think exactly the same problem arises in that the prototypical pet is some middle-sized cat or dog-like mammal object. And what the prototypical fish is, I'm not sure. When we ask people, it seems to depend a lot on whether they're thinking about restaurants or going fishing or going. People who think about the beach always seem to say shark first, although I never would have thought that a shark could be a prototypical fish. But in any case, it doesn't generally come out to be anything close to a guppy. So, I don't know. I mean, I would welcome help in sorting out the distinction between prototype and stereotype, because both of those notions are vague enough that it isn't real clear to me. But do you have? Well,
I may be not understanding the use of prototype as you're using it, but to me, I would look at grandmother as somebody who has grandchildren, rather than somebody whose wife is sitting in a rocker. And Texan as somebody who's either born in Texas
Sure.
or lives in Texas.
Sure.
And
Sure.
that my prototype,
Yeah.
I mean, is that a way that you would interpret prototype, to say somebody
Well,
who lives in or
well,
was
the
born
thing,
in Texas?
like there, I know there have been some further experiments done by the Gleitmans and others, taking the same kind of tests that Rosh and her colleagues used for terms like furniture and fruit and tool, and they tried some of the same kind of tests on words of the sort where you and I are agreeing that the extension is really determined in some sharp way by some criteria that don't have much to do with what we think of as typical cases. So they tried even with odd and even as applied to numbers, which clearly has an absolutely sharp definition. And they found people coming up with the same, with what looked like the same kind of prototypicality judgments, where something like 7 was the prototypical odd number, or something of that sort. So that they were in effect saying, well, the tests that were used to identify prototypes do not discriminate between concepts for which prototype would be reasonably seen as determinative of meaning, and those concepts for which there are strong either frequency effects or favorite example effects or stereotype associations. So that this itself may be turned around as a challenge to prototype theory. Can they find tests for what to count as prototype that won't also apply to cases where it's merely a stereotype or something even in the case of odd numbers, I'm not sure even the notion of stereotype is really applicable. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about experimental method, how you find out what people think, and how reliable that is?
Well, I'm not the best one to do that. We've drawn on existing literature, but we have not ourselves done any experimental work. So if you start with the Roche article, which is the classic, and then trace the things that have responded to that, I think you may find things there. I'm not for a moment disputing the idea that there are some very interesting, robust results in that area. The issue that Comp, who is a philosopher, and I, who am a linguist, have really gotten interested in is what's the relation between the things that psychologists study in their prototype studies and the concerns of the semantics of predicate words, and that's the only part I really feel very competent with that.
Sort of related to the stereotype idea is the idea of interpretation and how individual or how cultural or whatever that can be. I was thinking of this oxymoron, military intelligence is the classic example. How does the theory account for that kind of scenario? Can it be wary of all the loading that goes on to these words that can combine with each other in interesting ways?
Well, this is where we've been trying to find ways to discriminate between the case where the prototype really does determine the extension or the applicability of the term, and cases where the term has a prototype but that's not determining the real applicability. So in the cases like the case of nurse, for instance, there it seems to be very much a matter of cultural typicality, that in this culture most nurses are female, and so the prototypical or stereotypical nurse will be female. But we argue that should not be regarded as part of the meaning of nurse. If it were, then something like male nurse should be a contradiction, and it isn't. It may be, people may have to learn to get used to it, but I don't think anybody regards it as a contradiction. Whereas if you were to, you get into a very different kind of response if you were to try to say male spinster. And there you see, well, it's not just a matter of typicality, that spinsters are female. Now, because of this non-vacuity principle, I think we will try to interpret almost anything we hear in some way that makes it sensible. So I think the notion of female bachelors has been starting to catch on more than I think male spinsters is likely to. So even when we're trying to say, well, we can tell that femaleness is not part of the meaning of nurse, but merely part of a stereotype by observing that male nurse is not contradictory. But we have to be careful, because if female bachelor doesn't seem quite contradictory either, we have to ask, well, are people readjusting the whole meaning of the term, or is that showing that we're willing to reconstrue things that are contradictory on their literal meaning in a way that's non-literal? Probably the language itself goes through successive stages, and things that were once part of the meaning can cease to be, things that were once just part of typicality can cease to be. There was a very interesting dissertation done quite a number of years ago by Kathy Dahlgren at UCLA, documenting the history of the word which is the ancestor of the modern English word churl. And she noted that from a time shortly before the Norman conquest to a time shortly after, it changed its meaning from something like lowest class of free men to something like a relatively high class of bonded non-free men. And she said, now how could a Katz-Foder kind of feature-based theory ever account for a shift from plus free to minus free in the meaning of the term? She said, well, obviously that's not what went on. What went on was that term was like the name of a particular social class. The real world status of that class got changed. And it was only quite a long time later, after the breakup of the rigid social class system, that the term then did a further shift, ending up meaning the things which had been just connotations of the types of people, or the stereotypes concerning what kind of people the members of that social class were. And that's what we're left with now, churlish sort of fellow. Churl, it doesn't denote a social class anymore, because the social class that it denoted, kind of evaporated when that structure broke up. So that was a really interesting study. She studied a number of words like that, where the word gets its meaning in connection with the existence of a certain social class structure, names a certain class, properties of that class change, the term continues to denote that class, and therefore associated things like not being free or being free change with the changing status of the class. The class system breaks up, the term is then left meaning what it used to simply connote, or something that used to be just a stereotype, then became the meaning, and is now the meaning of that term. So these things don't stay fixed, once and for all. So of course it's not surprising that it will be sometimes hard in a particular instance to decide whether one of these properties is part of the meaning or isn't.